The detective found out his son worked in a feared gang, and he had to choose between law and blood. The rain hammered against the windows of Detective Frank O'Sullivan's cramped office on the 3rd floor of Chicago's 12th precinct. November 1923 had been particularly unforgiving, and the city seemed to bleed through its streets with every downpour. Frank sat hunched over his desk, the amber glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across crime scene photographs, scattered like a macabre deck of cards. The Torino family had been making headlines for months. What started as small-time bootlegging had escalated into something far more sinister. Bodies were dropping across the South Side with increasing frequency, each one bearing the unmistakable signature of professional violence. Frank had been tracking their operations for 8 months, slowly building a case that could finally bring down Vincent Torino and his crew of cold-blooded killers. His fingers drummed against the oak desk as he studied the latest photograph. Another warehouse worker found floating in the Chicago River, his throat cut with surgical precision. The coroner's report indicated the victim had been tortured before his death. Classic Torino methodology for extracting information from rivals or suspected informants. The office door creaked open, interrupting his thoughts. Sergeant Murphy, a weathered Irish cop with 30 years on the force, stepped inside without knocking. His face carried the perpetual expression of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. "Say, Frank, we got another one," Murphy said, tossing a manila folder onto the desk. "Same M.O. as the others. Found him in an alley behind Finnegan's pub." Frank opened the folder and winced. The victim was barely 20, his face beaten beyond recognition. But it wasn't the violence that made Frank's stomach turn. It was the location. Finnegan's pub was 3 blocks from his own apartment. The Torinos were expanding their territory, moving closer to neighborhoods that had previously been considered safe. "Any witnesses?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. "You know how it is. Everyone was suddenly deaf, dumb, and blind when we started asking questions." Murphy lit a cigarette and settled into the wooden chair across from Frank's desk. "But I heard something interesting from one of my informants." Frank looked up from the photographs. In 30 years of police work, Murphy's informants had never steered them wrong. The old sergeant had a network of contacts that stretched from the stockyards to the fancy hotels downtown. "Word is, Torino's been recruiting young men from good families," Murphy continued. "Kids with clean records, no previous connections to organized crime, makes them harder to track, and their families provide perfect cover." The implications sent a chill down Frank's spine. The Torinos weren't just expanding their territory, they were evolving their recruitment strategy. By targeting sons from respectable families, they could operate with a level of sophistication that previous gangs had never achieved. Frank's thoughts drifted to his own son, Michael. At 22, Michael was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed the kind of natural leadership qualities that Frank had always admired. After graduating from Northwestern University with a degree in business, Michael had taken a job with a shipping company downtown. The work paid well, and Michael seemed to be thriving in his new life as a young professional. But lately, Frank had noticed changes in his son's behavior. Michael's wardrobe had improved dramatically. Expensive suits, Italian leather shoes, a gold watch that cost more than Frank made in 3 months. When Frank had questioned him about it, Michael explained that his shipping company was doing exceptionally well, and he had received several bonuses for his excellent performance. Frank had wanted to believe his son, but 30 years of detective work had taught him to recognize when someone was lying. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. Michael's reluctance to discuss specific details about his work, his sudden acquisition of expensive possessions, and most troubling of all, the way he seemed to have developed an almost military bearing in his posture and speech. Thunder crashed outside, rattling the windows and bringing Frank back to the present moment. Murphy was studying him with concern, recognizing the familiar expression that crossed Frank's face when he was wrestling with a particularly difficult case. "What's eating at you, Frank?" Murphy asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank closed the manila folder and pushed it across the desk. The photograph of the young victim seemed to stare back at him, a reminder of the stakes involved in their investigation. Somewhere in the city, the Torinos were planning their next move, recruiting more young men into their organization and expanding their influence with each passing day. "Just thinking about the case," Frank replied, but his voice carried a weight that Murphy didn't miss. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the evidence of the day's crimes while new ones were undoubtedly being planned in the shadows of Chicago's underworld. Frank gathered his coat and hat, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh horrors and new challenges in his pursuit of justice. As he walked home through the rain-soaked streets, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the Torino investigation was about to become more personal than he had ever imagined. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick layer of industrial smoke that perpetually hung over Chicago's south side. Frank O'Sullivan sat in his unmarked police car, watching the entrance to the Meridian Shipping Company through a pair of field glasses. For 3 days, he had been conducting surveillance on the company, following up on a tip that suggested the business was being used as a front for illegal activities. What had started as a routine investigation had taken an unexpected turn when Frank discovered that his own son, Michael Howe, worked for the company. The coincidence seemed too convenient, and Frank's detective instincts were screaming that something was wrong. At precisely 8:15 a.m., Michael emerged from the building's main entrance. Frank watched his son through the binoculars, noting details that he had missed during their recent conversations at home. Michael moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, his leather briefcase gleaming in the morning light. But it wasn't Michael's appearance that troubled Frank the most. It was the company he kept. 3 other young men had accompanied Michael out of the building, all of them dressed with the same expensive taste, all carrying themselves with the same air of barely contained violence that Frank had learned to recognize in career criminals. Frank started his car and followed the group at a safe distance. They walked 6 blocks through the industrial district, eventually stopping at a warehouse that Frank recognized from his Torino investigation files. The building was registered under a series of shell companies, but Frank's research had revealed that it ultimately belonged to Vincent Torino himself. His heart sank as he watched his son disappear into the warehouse with the other men. For several minutes, Frank sat in his car, processing the implications of what he had just witnessed. The son he had raised, the young man he had sent to college and taught to value honesty and integrity, was somehow connected to the most dangerous criminal organization in Chicago. Frank returned to the precinct with a heavy heart, but he knew what he had to do. Professional duty demanded that he investigate further, regardless of his personal feelings. He spent the afternoon reviewing every file related to the Meridian Shipping Company, cross-referencing employee records with known criminal associates. The picture that emerged was more sophisticated than anything Frank had previously encountered. The Torinos had indeed evolved their recruitment strategy, targeting young men from middle-class families who could serve as legitimate fronts for their illegal operations. These recruits were given real jobs with real companies, but their primary function was to provide cover for money laundering, smuggling, and other criminal activities. By 6 p.m., Frank had compiled enough evidence to confirm his worst fears. The Meridian Shipping Company was deeply connected to the Torino organization, and Michael's name appeared on several documents that suggested he was more than just an unwitting employee. Frank drove home through the bustling evening traffic, his mind racing with questions and fears. How long had Michael been involved with the Torinos? Had he joined willingly, or had he been coerced? More importantly, how much did Michael know about the organization's violent activities? The O'Sullivan family home was a modest 2-story house in a working-class neighborhood that had been in the family for 15 years. Frank's wife, Catherine, had died 3 years earlier from tuberculosis, leaving Frank to raise Michael alone during his crucial final years of adolescence. Frank had always wondered if he had failed as a father, if his long hours at the police department had somehow driven his son toward the wrong path. Michael was waiting in the living room when Frank arrived home, seated in his father's favorite armchair with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as Frank entered, and for a moment, father and son stared at each other in silence. "We need to talk," Frank said, hanging his coat and hat on the rack beside the front door. Michael's expression didn't change, but Frank noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, a tell that had been present since Michael was a child and had been caught in a lie. "About what, Dad?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Frank walked to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a generous measure of Irish whiskey. He needed the liquid courage for what was about to be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. "I know where you work, Michael," Frank said quietly. I know about the warehouse, and I know about your association with Vincent Torino. Michael's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing a flash of fear before he regained control. He stood up from the chair, moving to the window that overlooked the street. How long have you known? Michael asked, his back still turned to his father. I suspected something was wrong for weeks. I confirmed it today. Frank took a long sip of his whiskey, feeling the burn as it went down. The question is, how long have you been lying to me? Michael turned around, and Frank was shocked by the transformation in his son's face. Gone was the innocent young man Frank remembered from college graduation. In his place stood someone harder, older, with eyes that had clearly seen things no 22-year-old should ever witness. 6 months, Michael admitted. I've been working for Mr. Torino for 6 months. The silence in the O'Sullivan living room stretched between father and son like a chasm that threatened to swallow them both. Frank set down his whiskey glass with trembling hands, the sound of crystal against wood echoing through the house like a gunshot. 6 months, Frank repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 months you've been working for a man who's responsible for at least 12 murders that I know of, and God knows how many more. Michael moved away from the window, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. The expensive suit that had once made Frank proud now seemed like a costume, a disguise that allowed his son to blend in with killers and thieves. It's not what you think, Dad, Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. The shipping company is legitimate. I handle paperwork, manage accounts, coordinate deliveries. I'm not involved in anything violent. Frank laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You think I'm naive, Michael? You think 30 years of police work hasn't taught me how these organizations operate? He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. They don't recruit college graduates to shuffle papers. They recruit intelligent young men who can help them appear respectable while they expand their criminal empire. Michael stopped pacing and faced his father directly. For the first time since the conversation began, Frank saw a glimpse of the defiance that had characterized Michael's teenage years. And what if they did? Michael asked. What if I am helping them appear respectable? This city is changing, Dad. The old rules don't apply anymore. Men like Vincent Torino understand that the future belongs to those who can adapt. Frank felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The young man standing before him was speaking like a true believer, someone who had been indoctrinated into a criminal philosophy that justified violence as a necessary tool of progress. Listen to yourself, Frank said, his voice rising. You're talking about murderers like they're business innovators. These people torture and kill anyone who gets in their way. They prey on the weak and corrupt everything they touch. Michael's expression hardened. And what about the police, Dad? What about the politicians and the judges who take bribes to look the other way? What about the businessmen who exploit workers and destroy communities for profit? At least Mr. Torino is honest about who he is. Frank realized with growing horror that his son wasn't just involved with the Torinos. He had been completely converted to their way of thinking. The intelligent, principled young man Frank had raised had been replaced by someone who saw moral complexity where there should have been clear distinctions between right and wrong. Michael, these people killed a 20-year-old kid 3 nights ago, Frank said, pulling out one of the crime scene photographs from his coat pocket. They tortured him for information, then cut his throat and dumped his body in an alley. Is that the kind of organization you want to be associated with? Michael glanced at the photograph, and Frank saw him flinch almost imperceptibly. But instead of the revulsion Frank had hoped for, he saw something else in his son's eyes. Recognition. You knew him, Frank said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. You knew the victim. Michael's silence was answer enough. Frank sank back into his chair, struggling to process the implications. His son hadn't just joined a criminal organization. He was connected to their most violent activities. His name was Tommy Brennan, Michael finally said, his voice flat and emotionless. He worked for a rival organization that was trying to muscle in on Mr. Torino's territory. What happened to him was regrettable, but it was necessary to send a message. Frank stared at his son in disbelief. The casual way Michael discussed the torture and murder of another human being was more terrifying than anything Frank had encountered in his decades of police work. Regrettable? Frank repeated. A young man is dead and you call it regrettable? Michael walked to the liquor cabinet and poured himself another whiskey. His movements were controlled and deliberate, displaying the kind of composure that Frank had seen in career criminals who had learned to compartmentalize their emotions. "You don't understand the pressures I was under, Dad," Michael said. "After college, I couldn't find decent work. The legitimate businesses weren't hiring, and the jobs that were available barely paid enough to survive. Mr. Torino offered me an opportunity to make something of myself." Frank felt a surge of guilt and anger. Had his focus on his police career blinded him to his son's struggles? Had he failed to provide the guidance and support that Michael needed during his transition from college to adult life? "You could have come to me," Frank said. "We could have figured something out together." Michael laughed bitterly. "Come to you? A cop who makes $40 a week and lives in the same house he bought 15 years ago? You've spent your entire life following rules that keep you poor while criminals get rich. I decided to choose a different path." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Frank and Michael both froze, staring at each other with sudden understanding. In the world of organized crime, unexpected visitors at night rarely brought good news. Frank moved toward the door, but Michael grabbed his arm. "Don't answer it," Michael whispered urgently. "If someone knows I'm here with you, it could be dangerous for both of us." Frank shook off his son's grip and walked to the window beside the front door. Peering through the curtains, he saw two men in expensive overcoats standing on his front porch. They had the look of professional enforcers, calm, patient, and undoubtedly armed. "Friends of yours?" Frank asked quietly. Michael's face had gone pale. "We need to leave, now, through the back door." But before they could move, one of the men outside called out in a voice that carried clearly through the walls of the house. "Detective O'Sullivan, we'd like to have a word with you about your son." Frank O'Sullivan's hand instinctively moved toward the service revolver holstered beneath his coat as the voice outside repeated its request. Through the front window's thin curtains, he could see the two men waiting with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "Detective O'Sullivan," the voice called again. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to talk." Michael grabbed his father's arm, his face ashen with fear. "Dad, these aren't just any enforcers. The tall one is Marcus Romano, Vincent Torino's personal bodyguard. The other one is Eddie Kowalski. They only get sent out when someone has seriously crossed the organization." Frank studied his son's terrified expression and realized that Michael's involvement with the Torinos might be even deeper and more dangerous than he had imagined. The fact that Vincent Torino's personal enforcers had come to his home suggested that his investigation had somehow threatened the organization's operations. "What did you tell them about me?" Frank demanded in a harsh whisper. Nothing," Michael replied, but his eyes betrayed him. "I mean, they knew you were a cop, but everyone knows that. I never discussed your work with anyone." Frank moved away from the window and checked the back door. The small yard behind his house was surrounded by a wooden fence that led to an alley, but he could see shadows moving in the darkness beyond. The Torinos had covered both exits. "Detective O'Sullivan," the voice outside called for a third time. "We know you're in there, and we know your son is with you. We're not going anywhere until we have our conversation." Frank made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He walked to the front door and opened it, stepping onto the porch with his hands visible but ready to draw his weapon if necessary. Marcus Romano was indeed tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that suggested military training. Eddie Kowalski was shorter but broader, with scarred knuckles and eyes that had seen too much violence. Both men wore expensive overcoats that barely concealed the weapons beneath. "Detective O'Sullivan," Romano said politely. "Thank you for agreeing to talk with us. May we come inside?" Frank glanced back at his house, where Michael was presumably waiting in terror. Every instinct told him to refuse, to demand that the men leave his property immediately. But he also knew that antagonizing Vincent Torino's enforcers could have deadly consequences for both him and his son. "5 minutes. Frank said. "You say what you came to say, then you leave." Romano nodded respectfully. "That's all we need." Frank led the two men into his living room, where Michael was sitting rigidly in his chair, trying to maintain composure but clearly terrified. Romano and Kowalski settled themselves on the couch, their movements controlled and professional. "Your son has been a valuable employee," Romano began without preamble. "Mr. Torino has been very impressed with his intelligence and his dedication to the organization." Frank said nothing, waiting for the men to reveal their true purpose. However, Romano continued. We've recently become aware that certain information about our business operations has found its way into police files. Information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of our activities. Frank felt his stomach drop. The implication was clear. They suspected Michael of being an informant. Michael would never betray the organization, Frank said carefully. He's told me himself how much he respects Mr. Torino. Kowalski spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly and threatening. Respect is one thing, Detective. Loyalty is another. We've learned that someone has been providing detailed information about our shipping schedules, our financial arrangements, and our personnel. Michael finally found his voice. I haven't told anyone anything. I swear on my mother's grave. I've been completely loyal to Mr. Torino. Romano studied Michael with the calculating gaze of a man who had made a career of detecting lies. We believe you, Michael, which is why we're here tonight. Frank sensed that the conversation was about to take an even more dangerous turn. The leak is coming from somewhere inside the police department, Romano continued. Someone with access to high-level investigative files has been sharing information with our competitors. Mr. Torino believes that this person might be trying to frame loyal employees like Michael to cover their own tracks. Frank realized with growing horror where the conversation was heading. The Torinos weren't just suspicious of Michael. They wanted Frank to help them identify the real informant within the police department. What exactly are you asking me to do? Frank said. Romano leaned forward slightly. Mr. Torino would like you to conduct a quiet investigation within your own department. Find out who has been leaking information and report back to us. In exchange, we guarantee Michael's safety and continued employment. Frank looked at his son, seeing the desperate hope in Michael's eyes. The choice before him was agonizing. He could protect his son by betraying his colleagues and compromising his own integrity, or he could maintain his principles and potentially watch his son die. And if I refuse? Frank asked. Kowalski's hand moved slightly inside his coat. Mr. Torino would be very disappointed. He might begin to suspect that the leak is coming from someone very close to the investigation. The threat was unmistakable. If Frank refused to cooperate, they would assume that either he or Michael was the informant, with deadly consequences for both of them. Frank stood up abruptly, pacing to the window as he wrestled with the impossible decision. Outside, the Chicago streets looked peaceful and normal, but he knew that his world had been irrevocably changed. The line between law and crime, between right and wrong, had become blurred beyond recognition. I need time to think, Frank said. Romano checked his expensive pocket watch. Mr. Torino is a patient man, but his patience has limits. You have 48 hours to make your decision and begin your investigation. The two enforcers stood to leave, their business concluded for the evening. Romano paused at the front door and turned back to Frank. Detective O'Sullivan, I want you to understand that we're not your enemies. We're simply businessmen trying to protect our interests. Your cooperation would benefit everyone involved. After the men left, Frank and Michael sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. I'm sorry, Dad, Michael finally whispered. I never meant for any of this to happen. Frank looked at his son, the young man he had raised, protected, and loved, and realized that their relationship had been forever changed by the choices they had both made. Dawn broke gray and cold over Chicago, casting long shadows across Frank O'Sullivan's sleepless face as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the badge that had defined his identity for 3 decades. Beside the badge lay his service revolver, cleaned and loaded, and a letter of resignation that he had written and rewritten 6 times during the long night. 48 hours had passed since Marcus Romano and Eddie Kowalski had delivered Vincent Torino's ultimatum. Frank had spent those hours wrestling with a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of his son and potentially dozens of innocent people. Michael had barely left his room during those 2 days, emerging only for brief, awkward conversations that danced around the central question. Neither of them wanted to address directly. What was Frank going to do? At precisely 8 a.m., Frank's telephone rang. He knew without answering that it would be Romano, calling to learn his decision. Detective O'Sullivan. Romano's voice was as calm and professional as it had been 2 nights earlier. Have you had sufficient time to consider Mr. Torino's proposal? Frank closed his eyes and made the choice that he had known, deep in his heart, was inevitable. I can't do it, Frank said quietly. I can't betray my fellow officers, even to save my son. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Romano responded. That's very unfortunate, Detective. Mr. Torino will be disappointed. Romano, Frank said, his voice growing stronger. I want to make you an offer. I'm listening. I'll give you the information you want, but not about my fellow officers. I'll give you information about Vincent Torino himself. I'll testify about everything I've learned during my investigation. I'll provide evidence that will put him away for life. Romano's laugh was cold and humorless. And in exchange, you let Michael walk away. Clean break. No retaliation. No questions asked. He disappears from Chicago and never has any contact with your organization again. Detective, I think you misunderstand the situation. Michael doesn't want to leave the organization. He's made his choice, just as you've made yours. Frank felt his last hope crumbling. He had assumed that Michael was trapped, coerced into working for the Torinos, but Romano's words suggested something far worse, that Michael had chosen this life willingly and had no desire to escape. Let me talk to him, Frank said. He's already here, Detective. He's been here since yesterday afternoon. Frank's blood ran cold. While he had been agonizing over his decision, Michael had already made his own choice. His son had chosen loyalty to Vincent Torino over loyalty to his own father. Put him on the phone, Frank demanded. After a moment, Michael's voice came through the receiver, sounding distant and strained. Dad? Michael, what are you doing? Come home. We'll figure this out together. I can't, Dad. This is my life now. Mr. Torino has been more of a father to me in 6 months than you were in 22 years. The words hit Frank like physical blows. Every missed dinner, every broken promise, every time he had chosen his police work over his family responsibilities came flooding back with crushing clarity. Michael, please, Frank whispered. You're my son. You're all I have left. I know, Dad, and I'm sorry, but I've made my choice. Romano's voice returned to the line. Detective O'Sullivan, you have 1 hour to reconsider your position. After that, we'll be forced to assume that you represent a threat to our organization. The line went dead. Frank sat in his kitchen, surrounded by the artifacts of a life dedicated to law enforcement, and realized that he had lost everything that truly mattered. His wife was dead, his son had chosen crime over family, and his career was about to end in disgrace or violence. But as he sat there, Frank felt something unexpected, a sense of clarity that he hadn't experienced in months. The moral confusion that had plagued him since discovering Michael's involvement with the Torinos suddenly lifted, replaced by a simple understanding of what needed to be done. Frank picked up his telephone and dialed the direct number for FBI agent William Hayes, a federal investigator who had been pressuring the Chicago Police Department to cooperate in a major racketeering investigation. Agent Hayes, Frank said when the call was answered. This is Detective Frank O'Sullivan, Chicago PD. I have information about Vincent Torino that you're going to want to hear. 3 hours later, Frank sat in a federal building downtown, providing detailed testimony about everything he had learned during his investigation. He told Agent Hayes about the Torino organization's recruitment strategies, their use of legitimate businesses as fronts, their methods of intimidation and murder. He also told them about his son. Detective O'Sullivan, Agent Hayes said after Frank had finished his statement, you realize that your testimony will likely result in your son's arrest, along with the rest of the Torino organization. Frank nodded. I understand. But maybe prison will give him a chance to remember who he used to be before Vincent Torino got his hooks into him. That evening, as federal agents prepared to execute warrants across the city, Frank returned to his empty house and poured himself a glass of Irish whiskey. The badge still lay on his kitchen table, but he no longer saw it as a symbol of his identity. Instead, he saw it as a reminder that some choices, no matter how painful, were necessary to preserve the thin line between civilization and chaos. Outside, Chicago continued its restless existence, unaware that one man's decision to choose law over blood had set in motion events that would reshape the city's criminal landscape forever. Frank O'Sullivan had lost his son, but he had saved his soul. The telephone rang once more that night. But Frank didn't answer it. He knew it would be either Romano delivering threats or Michael pleading for forgiveness. Either way, the time for talking had passed. In the morning, federal agents would arrest Vincent Torino and dozens of his associates. Michael O'Sullivan would be among them, charged as an accessory to murder and racketeering. The shipping company would be shut down, the money laundering operations exposed, and the reign of terror would finally end. Frank would retire from the police force and spend his remaining years knowing that he had made the hardest choice of his life, and the right one.